I'm Merle Kushner, and I serve on the Sisterhood Steering Committee here at Temple Beth Am, as well as being a member of our LIZKOR committee. And together we're proud to bring you today's program. The mission of LIZKOR, spearheaded by Ellie Anbinder, who's here today, is remembering and honoring the past for future generations. We know that the aim of the Nazis under Hitler, as with other genocides, was the annihilation of a culture along with her people. I largely knew Yiddish as a spoken language and the language of Jewish theater and performers through my grandparents, but during a trip to the Yiddish Book Center this past fall, organized by our sisterhood, I became more aware of the depth and breadth of the Yiddish language through literature, civic-minded pamphlets, advertisements, and musical scores, among other sources, all of which could have been lost and can be studied and appreciated today. We're so fortunate to have as our presenter today, maybe post-siesta from Spain, I don't know, Maia Evrona. Maia is a poet as well as a translator of Yiddish poetry. Her original writing has been supported with 2 joint Fulbright Scholar Awards to Spain and Greece, as well as with a grant from the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Her translations of Yiddish poetry have received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Yiddish Book Center, and the American Literary Translators Association. She's been characterized as a representative of a new generation of Yiddish poet-translators. While she now lives in Spain, she grew up in the Temple Beth Am Community, and her parents, Sheila Statlender and Russ Donnelly, are here in person today and are still members of the temple. And we wish to thank you for the complimentary copies of From a Bird's Cage to a Thin Branch. Maia will give a reading of her translations of the Yiddish poets Avrom Sutzkever, a survivor of the Vilna Ghetto, and Yosef Kerler, a Yiddish poet from Ukraine, as well as selections of her own poetry in English and Yiddish. There are many stories of how the arts were linked to the survival of people during the Holocaust. In some cases, people were forced into performing because of their talents. Many more found reason to live and were a humanizing force for the souls with which they were imprisoned in ghettos and concentration camps. Breathing new life into the world, giving voice to these poets, and reinvigorating the Yiddish spoken and written word if her maternal grandparents, at the most tender of ages, had not been spared. And her mother, Sheila, would like to come and say a few words, and I want to give a warm welcome, I hope I get this right, a guten Tag to Maia.
I don't want to take too much time away from Maia's presentation, but I do think that it's an important backdrop to understand that, I was the daughter of immigrant parents. My parents came here, my mother when she was 5, and my father when he was 9 months old. They spoke unaccented English, and because they came before World War II, it took me a while to understand that we were impacted by the Holocaust as well. In fact, I sometimes felt a sort of survivor guilt that we hadn't suffered in quite the same way. My mother came at the age of 5 with her brother, who was 13 months older, and her 2 parents. They came through Rotterdam, so that when my sister and I were on my very low budget graduation trip through Europe, we wanted to make a point of going to Rotterdam to just stand there and see the point where she'd come to this country from. She told the story of her brother who was seasick for the whole voyage and quite ill. And she turned to her grandfather, who I never had the pleasure of meeting, and said, "Father, why did we come 3rd class?" And he answered, "Because there was not a 4th class." My father's father came from Poland. He and his brothers, the story goes, came to the United States to look around, to scope things out, and decide if they wanted to move here. They went back to Poland, to Lodz, And my father's father was the only of one of the three brothers to come here to decide to do that. My father was 9 months old. Um, so the result was that my father's family survived, as did his children, but the brothers who went back did not. They perished in the Holocaust. There were some children, first cousins of my father's, who did survive. And one of the proudest things of my life is that my parents sponsored two brothers to come here after the war. They each had remarried, had lost first wives, and had lost children. One of the books that Maia has published her poems in, the hideouts, hiding places, I always get it wrong. It's the hardcover book that we brought for you to look over. Talks about the hiding places that people use to try to save children. We all know about the Anne Frank story. Well, my father's cousin tried to hide his two daughters under a hidden staircase, or a hideout in the staircase. They were discovered and they were put to death. So I don't know how much Maia was aware of directly about these stories, and I don't want to speak for her. But I do know that in the fourth grade, she became very interested in the Holocaust and was studying the Holocaust, did a report on it in public school. And the teachers approached us and said that we might want to keep an eye on it because it was such disturbing material. At some point, after a period when she'd been quite ill as a child, she became interested in Yiddish because she had, I think, initially read the book from the Yiddish Book Center, Outwitting History. But she grew well past that. She found tutors. She took a class at Harvard Extension. And eventually, when she was well enough, she wanted to study at the Jewish Study Center, Yiddish Study Center, not in New York, not in Montreal, but in Lithuania, in Vilnius. And all I could think was, this is the part of the world my parents ran away from. My daughter wants to go, were you 19 at the time? I don't know. Yeah. So I insisted that I had to go with her to get her settled and to make sure it was safe. I don't think she was real happy about that, but it was quite the experience for me. And I will sort of end by saying that when I witnessed my daughter speaking fluent Yiddish with the elder in that program, who herself had been a partisan and had fought against the Nazis from the woods. And I heard fluent Yiddish going on, which I hadn't heard since my grandmother. Well, my grandmother lived with us when I was quite young, and my parents spoke fluent Yiddish, usually so that we wouldn't understand what they were saying. It was really an incredible sort of moving experience. What I discovered through Maia, and I think Merle, you alluded to this a moment ago, is that this is not just about a language. It's about a culture. It's about a people who had, very rich literature and theater, and just a rich intellectual life. And I think that the language was really sort of dismissed and reviled and almost lost as being inferior and was incredibly misunderstood. So this current revival that Maia has been a part of is so important and so enlightening for many of us. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Maia to speak for herself.
Hello, everyone. And I just want to make sure, first of all, that the volume is good and everybody can hear me well. So if there aren't any issues, I'm going to keep going. And so maybe I should start by saying that when part of my interest in translating poetry from Yiddish was that I was also writing my own poetry, and the practice of translating can be a way of exploring your own voice as a poet and inspiring your own work. And it seemed natural to me to translate from a language that I felt a personal connection to. And so that was a big part of the reason why I started studying Yiddish. And I thought that it would be nice because I'm tuning in from Spain. I'm actually in the Canary Islands right now. That there would be copies of the books of my translations, the Yosef Kerler book, and the book that includes my Sutzkever translations, so that you would have something physical in front of you. However, after that, there was the meeting recently with Zelensky and Trump, this horrible meeting. And I realized that I really wanted to start with a poem that I recently translated by a poet named Dovid Hofshteyn. And then after that, I'll move on to the poems by Kerler and Sutzkever. But I think that when you hear this poem, you'll understand why I wanted to begin with it. Dovid Hofshteyn was a poet, a Yiddish poet from Ukraine, and he was infamously murdered on what is now known as the Night of the Murdered Poets in 1952. He wrote this poem in response to the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, and it is called Ukraine. By blast and by smoke and by ash and by shame, I catch sight as you raise your ruined hand. Now your head rises, blood-stained. I see your face. Oh, you're alive. Oh, you're alive. Your gaze, still a child's, now with a mother's pain. And the joy that arrives after peril now shines. The clarity that follows chaos and mistake. Like the water of spring flowing beneath ice. I glimpse your figure rise, your frame, to which the remnants of clothes barely cling, and their dirty rags fall from your limbs. It's clear now, you are a child, all grown. You are a wife. You are a body bright with beauty that shines through disgrace, through mockery, through the violence of hate. You are a young, unsoiled, confident might that laughs, that transforms, that grows clear without end, that will fast heal its pain, its shame. You are Ukraine, my home. Ukraine, my land. And if you would like to hear the Yiddish, I will read it. Ukraine. Von Reuch und von Bruch und von Asch und von Schand. Ich der See. Du der häubst dein zerschädigte Hand. Ot der häubt sich dein Kopf, was mit Blut ist beklebt. Ich der seh dein Gesicht. Oh, lebt. Oh, lebt. Dein noch kinderischer Blick mit schein mutterschen Zar. Und es leucht schon die Freude, was kommt an noch Gefahr. Der Verstand, was kommt an noch Vertummlung und Greiz. Wie Wasser von Frühling von unter dem Eis. Ich der See. Ot der häubt sich dein Guf, dein Gestalt. Was die Reschlach von Kleider auf ihm kein sich halt. Und es fallen die schmutzige Schmattes von Leib. Sie ist Susan Scheun. Sie ist ein Kind der Wachsens, ein Weib. Sie ist ein lichtiger Körper mit Schönheit, was scheint. I durch Schand, i durch Spott, ieder Gewalttat von Feind. Sie ist eine junge, eine säubere, sichere Kraft, was sich wehrt, was sich leitert und aufhört und lacht. Was wird gich, sie verhellen die Wehen, die Schand. Sie ist Ukraine, mein Heim, Ukraine, mein Land. Now I'm going to move on to the poems that are in From a Bird's Cage to a Thin Branch, the selected poems of Yosef Kerler. This is the Red Book. Yosef Kerler was an important post-war Yiddish poet. He was born in, I believe, 1918, perhaps 1919, and he served with the Red Army. Like Hofshteyn, he was born in Ukraine, and he was the younger generation after Hofshteyn. He has a poem in which he laments that he's both the youngest and the last. He served with the Red Army during World War II, but then within about 5 years, he ended up in the Gulag for advocating the teaching of Yiddish. He was sent to a Gulag that was north of the Arctic Circle. And he was there in 1952 on the day that Hofshteyn and 4 other Yiddish poets, along with a number of Jewish intellectuals, were murdered in Lubyanka prison on what is now known as the Night of the Murdered Poets. And since I began with the poem by Hofshteyn, I thought that I would begin the selection of Kerler translations with a poem about the Night of the Murdered Poets. It's called August 12th, 1952. And it's page 68 in From a Bird's Cage to a Thin Branch, if you have it in front of you. August 12th, 1952. On this very day, we tighten our hold on our pain and our weeping, the pain in our hearts, our lament through clenched teeth. Bergelsen, Markish, Kvitko, and Hofshteyn. They were felled in the middle of the night, and no one brought them any solace before death. And the only light that anointed them at the end came right at the flash of the murderous volley. On this very day, I raise up and I carry my blood-spattered song, my poem a gravestone, my heart a candle. But I will not now, it would seem, fulfill my duty. There is nowhere to sit down, candle nor stone. Bergelsen, Markish, Kvitko, and Hofshteyn. And for this one, I will read the Yiddish to go along with it. Those who are somewhat familiar with Yiddish might know that in the original poem, there is a play between the stone that Kerler wants to lay on the grave that doesn't exist and the name Hofshteyn, which so Stein, stone in Yiddish, is Stein. And those who know something about the Night of the Murdered Poets might know that there's actually a poet who's left out of this poem. His name was Pfeffer. And at the time, I believe that Kerler may not have known that Pfeffer had been murdered. Kerler was in the Gulag at the time, although there was some controversy about Pfeffer. There's also a theory. Yosef Kerler's son Dovid told me this, that Perhaps he was left out because he was younger than the other poets. And the Yiddish goes, in dem dozigen Tag, in dem dozigen Tag, versparen mir stärker die Pein und die Klag. Wait a second. Die Pein in dem Herzen, die Klag zwischen Stein, Bergelsen, Markisch, Quitko und Hofshteyn. Sie seien gefallen inmitten der Nacht, und es hat keiner kein Trost fern Tod sie gebracht. Und die einzige Schein, welche hat sie gesalbt, ist gewesen dann der Blitz von dem russischen Salb. In dem dosigen Tag, mein zerblutigt Gesang heb ich auf und ich trag. Mein Lied am Zewe, mein Herz wie ein Licht. Nur ich will scheuen, weißt euch, nicht erfüllen mein Pflicht. Es ist nicht da, wo zu stellen, kein Licht und kein Stein. Bergelsen, Markisch, Quitko und Hofshteyn. And as I said, Kerler was sent to a gulag that was north of the Arctic Circle. And this next poem was also written in the gulag. Northern Lights. The snow here is black, the coal red, and blue as a spleen is human skin. The snow here is black from dust, the coal red from blood, and the body is stunned by the rod. But look, all the colors are at play in the sky. All at once they could scream, "You are not allowed to die." And I'm sorry, I forgot to note that this poem, Northern Lights, is page 48. Sonnenschein. Der Schnee ist do schwarz, die Steinkeulen rot, und blau wie ein Milz ist die menschliche Haut. Der Schnee ist do schwarz von dem Stäub, die Steinkeulen rot von Blut, und das Leib ist verblüfft von der Rut. Nur sie, in Himmel spielen alle Farben, gleich schreien wollten sie, du darfst nicht sterben. And that's probably my favorite poem from this whole collection, is that one. Now I'm going to go a little bit back in time, although this poem is actually at the end of the book. It's on page 142. And as Kerler was from Ukraine, he was born in a small shtetl, and then he grew up actually on a Jewish collective farm in Crimea. He was very affected by Babi Yar, which was the infamous mass killing site in the forest. It was in a ravine in Ukraine where much of Kiev's Jewish population was murdered. I think something like 30,000 people were shot in pits over 2 days. And by the end of the war, the death count there was over 100,000. And I think that you can understand how affected Kerler was by this, by the fact that he notes that he first wrote this poem in Kiev in 1949. but he didn't really consider it finished until 1991 when he was living in Jerusalem. And in recent years, there have been 2 volumes of Ukrainian poetry about Babi Yar. One was by a single poet, and the other was an anthology by Ukrainian poets about Babi Yar. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were not Jewish, but all of the poems were written in Ukrainian. And there's an anthology that I think was published by Harvard University Press of them translated into English, which is very good because Babi Yar has been quite controversial for a number of reasons. During Soviet times, it was illegal to acknowledge that the majority of the victims had been Jewish. And then there's also the question of Ukrainian collaboration in the murders. So to have an anthology of Ukrainian poetry about Babi Yar is very important. At the same time, it's important to remember that the majority of the victims of Babi Yar spoke Yiddish. So I very much wanted to include this poem in this anthology because it's a Yiddish poem about Babi Yar. And perhaps some people remember that at the beginning of the war, the current war in Ukraine, Russia actually bombed Babi Yar. It was in the very first few months. So that's another reason why I felt that translating this poem was important. It's called At Babi Yar. Don't remain here, brother, face to face with only yourself, lest tears gush forth from all those who, before death, had no tears to shed. Brother, toward people you should go, into the thicket of the human whirlpool. Then, at least one person among thousands will perhaps hear the strangled weeping of mothers and of children when the grass was bathed in fresh dew. Those prayers that never reached the heavens, which at that moment shone so gentle and so blue. And if you didn't catch it, it's page 142 in the book of Kerler translations. Beim Babi Yar. Verbleib nicht, Bruder, Oig auf Oig, mit sich allein, weil es kenn von dir, ersparton das Gewinn, von alle die, was haben verteut, kein Träger nicht gehabt. Zu Menschenbruder sollst du gehen, in der Gedichte nicht, von menschlichen Gewimmel. Efter chodsch zu einem zwischen tausend, wird der gehen, von Mames und von Kinder, das der Worgene gewähnt. Wenn es hat das groß, geboren sich in frischen Teu, die vieles nicht der Gerechte zu dem Himmel, was hat sich dann gelichtigt, also mild und bleu. And now I'm going to end with, I'm going to end my selection of Kerler poems with 2 poems that he wrote in the late 1940s from his hometown, which was Hiddin, Ukraine. It was a shtetl. And he was born there, but they moved. I forget how old he was, but he spent the majority of his childhood in Crimea, actually. But he returned to the shtetl that he was born in the late 1940s, and he wrote 2 poems about it, but he didn't publish them until a few decades later. And I think that they show the complicated feelings that he had about Ukraine and the sense of belonging, but also the sense of having been persecuted and rejected. And I think maybe people know that the word goy in Yiddish, it technically means Ukrainian. So many Yiddish poets had very complicated feelings about both belonging to Ukraine and feeling rejected by Ukraine. And this poem is called To the Builder, and it's page 32 in From a Bird's Cage to a Thin Branch. To the Builder. How joyfully young trees have grown over the dust and ash of bones. And if to planting trees you lent your hand, would anyone understand that you were one of them? Your sweat is mixed into each new building's bricks, and young children play in new town squares. But where will you find a gentle word to soothe your burning pain? People will forget and efface all the same. They will deny your flesh and blood. The knife in the heart is all that will remember you, and the first stone will not pass you by. For this one, I think I'm not going to read the original Yiddish just to save some time, but I'm going to move on to another poem that was written in Chaysen, and it's page 34. A lovely forest once did grow. A lovely forest once did grow. A lovely forest. The wicked axe laid it low, laid it low. And the nightingale flitters to and fro, to and fro. Its song rings with pain and woe, pain and woe. It splits the sky with every trill, every trill. Where did my forest go? Where did my forest go? Where did my forest go? And now I'm going to move on to poems by Avrom Sutzkever. These poems are in the Architecture of Survival book. And so, because we're switching to Avrom Sutzkever, this means going back to Lithuania. Sutzkever was born in, I think, 1913 in modern-day Belarus, but he spent his formative young adult years in Vilna, which was also where I studied Yiddish and where my mother talked about visiting. And he survived the Holocaust in the Vilna Ghetto. And I think at the beginning, Merle talked about, cultural resistance and producing art during the war. And Sutzkever believed fervently that writing poetry would save him somehow. And prior to the Holocaust, he had actually been kind of ridiculed in the literary scene of Yiddish Vilna for aspiring to be a lyric poet. But then during the Holocaust, he really rose to the occasion and took part in cultural and armed resistance, all the while continuing to write poetry. Some of his poetry was then smuggled out of the Vilna Ghetto and then was distributed in Moscow, where it became some of the first-hand testimonies of the Holocaust to be read and to be widely circulated. He remained in the ghetto until it became too dangerous, and then he escaped through the sewers and hid out for a time in the sewers before eventually escaping from the sewers to join the partisans in the forest. And then he was actually airlifted by, I believe, the Lithuanian government in exile from the forest to Moscow, all because of the poetry that he had written. So he was actually right in the end that writing poetry did save his life. And so about a year and a half ago, I was asked to translate 9 poems from a collection called Secret City that Sutzkever wrote about escaping the Vilna Ghetto through the sewers for this collection, The Architecture of Survival. And so I thought that I would read these poems. And I'm going to skip the foreword, and I'm just going to start with the poems themselves. And those of you who know some Yiddish might know that Sutsk in Yiddish, hometown, it's Heimstadt. So Heim is home and Stadt is city. So hometown is Heimstadt. But Sutzkever called this collection of poems about hiding in the sewers Secret City. And in Yiddish, secret is Geheim. So it's Geheimstadt. And there's a play on Heimstadt, Geheimstadt. But it's hard to recreate in English, so I went with Secret City. And I'm not sure, I don't have the book in front of me, but so I can't tell you what page number the poems are on. But if you look in the table of contents, you should be able to find them. And so I'm just gonna start. Secret City. Do you remember the harvest sun, its spiders, sent out to blanket the houses in webs of fires? Do you remember the people on that dawn, disheveled as chickens not quite slaughtered? In the crucible of the Jewish setting sun, there melted a silver candlestick, a gutter, a chimney, shattered windows, sooty cinders, the synagogue courtyard, the slaughterhouse, hatred, anger, the guns in the tower, the child in crib, and all the likenesses drowned deep in the mirror. Gedenkst du die Hauptsun, was hat ihre Spinnen, geschickt zu verweben die Kaiser mit Streifes? Gedenkst du die Menschen in jenem Beginnen, zerschäubert wie Nitken der keulete Eufes? In Tiegel von Jidvergang hat sich geschmolzen, a silberne Leichter, a Käumen, a Rine. Zersplitterte Scheiben, versagete Holzen, der Schulchef, die Beine, der Zorn, die Sinne, die Biegsaffenturen, das Kind in dem Wiegel und alle Gestalten, der Trunken in Spiegel. My body, the crucible's melted substance, lay buried until night came to my bed. Was it because the rain chattered above, locking its lightning flashes in drops of glass? Or because a dream commanded my vision to push through stratums to study reality? My every limb opened up an eyelash to see within suffering a blinding clarity, with glass in my hair like cold fireflies. I trudged through the narrow old alleys. And to keep you in the poems, which are telling a story, I'm going to skip the Yiddish. I'm going to just read the English. Curse on 2 feet, who asked that you slyly Disguise yourself in a splinter from heaven, a stride, a step, in the midst of the question, like the rustle of dry leaves in bad weather. A woman halts, catches me here in a vice, and clasps me with an arm full of life. She reaches for me with the other. I am no stranger. I am as rich as you are, as poor as you are. You have no others, no better roads. Come here. Come into our secret city and ask no questions. What more could I lose? Soaked in the blaze, slowly I skipped through the muddy quiet. What then does the last have to lose? The last, on these alleys arranged like a burning cage. Riddled with sparks, the air still flashed, frayed with bullets, gorging on pain. The woman, old and gray, limped onwards, raised from the cobblestones a rusty grate, and the sun shone over us no more. We were down in the realm of the sewers. So, could you ever have dreamed that here, where filthy water flows, would be our only place of refuge? You would call that prophet a clown. Now, with this foolish skin on my torso, I swim through stink, through a sticky gloom, through vaults like mouse holes. On whom can I call? Where is their respite, the faintest of stars? The water above swirls at a standstill and giggles in the language of mice. My lover. Memory cannot recall how long I swam through sun-dry pipes, some narrow, some wide. Was it a year, an hour? But we arrived at an isolated sort of place, like a cellar. There was a sewer, so old that for years now no water had flowed. Voices drowned out the damp serenity, and figures emerged, cloud gray, like shadows hidden in haze. And she who delivered me here greets them. Good day. Figures like black pupils sniff me over, inspect me, as animals do to a newborn. And they touch, gray gestures, they reach, searching in me for the ones lost by each. There are Jews still alive, a hushed uproar, or are we the only 10 left? And there above, glimpsed through a grate, in a speck of the sky, doves circled the air, bright in the sun. A bluish breath coiled upward. Out of 10, in spite of the devil, a people will come. And now to end, I'm going to read some of my own poems. I just need to take a sip of water. Just one second. And since we've spoken a bit about Vilna, where I studied Yiddish, and where Sutzkever was from, I thought that I would read a poem about Vilna. And I went to the summer program at Vilnius University twice. But unfortunately, it's now defunct because they lost their funding, which is really too bad because I think it was important for there to be a Yiddish institute there. But I still have this poem, and I'm going to read it. It's called Vilna. There was that strange scent both times I went, almost unpleasant, kept me recalling that blood once ran down the cobblestone streets. Yet it was tender, like grass in the rain. Each time I arrived amid plenty of rain, though I'm certain the days lasted longer. The first time, the first summer, just as that month seemed longer than when I went anywhere, again for a month. Bled into the months and the years I walked down after those white evenings in summer. And in case anyone doesn't know what a white evening is, Vilna is so far north that in the summer there are a few weeks when it never gets completely dark. So that was what I was mentioning in that poem. This next poem is called The Poem of the Paper Bird. And in Yiddish folklore, there's a legend that says that when the Messiah comes, the righteous will go to the land of Israel on a bridge made out of paper, while the wicked will go to Gehenna on a bridge made out of iron. And this has inspired a number of Yiddish poems. And so one of my early poems was my own take on this legend, in which I turned the bridge into a bird. And it was actually the first poem that I ever published. It was a semi-finalist for this big prize. It was the Montreal International Poetry Prize. And I found out like 10 years later that this prize had actually been begun thanks to a monetary gift from Leonard Cohen. And it was a very big deal for me that Leonard Cohen was involved in the publication of my first poem. Although it would have been a lot better if I had won the prize, but I'll take this. It's called The Poem of the Paper Bird. My paper bird is white as a dove. My paper bird is graceful as a crane, with its long paper neck and pointed beak. My paper bird has sight like a hawk and could give you a scratch, a stinging paper cut. My paper bird has a song, beautiful as a nightingale's, written on each of its paper wings. My paper bird has no iron-barred cave. I keep my paper bird on my kitchen table, next to my paper rose. And now I'm going to read a poem that is about Yiddish, but I actually wrote it in Spain, and it was, I think I wrote it in Cordoba, and it was inspired by exploring the remnants of Jewish life in Spain, and the expulsion of Jews from Spain, and thinking about how that compared to the summers I had spent in Lithuania, exploring the remnants of the Holocaust. And there is Yiddish wordplay that's embedded within the English. And so not long after I published it, I was asked by the Yiddish Book Center if I had any poems about Yiddish for an anthology that they were planning to publish. It was a very short anthology of just 6 poems. And so I offered them this poem, and I offered to translate it into Yiddish. And so they took it, and I translated it into Yiddish. So I'm going to read both the English and the Yiddish. It is called Hiddin Yiddish. Perhaps there is memory growing out of oblivion, a miracle happening on a journey. As the nightingale sings an aching soliloquy, buried in a forest in Poland. And the Yiddish goes, Behaltene Yiddish. Efter der Wohnung wächst Reus von dem Mond. Efter Nes geschät Aphanisia. Beschas der Soloway singt sich ein Monolog von Wehen, beerdigt in der Wald, in Nita. And so for some other poems that I've written in Spain, when I first arrived in Barcelona, one of the first side trips that I did was to a little town on the French-Spanish border called Portbou. Portbou it's a Catalan word, and it's a really lovely town right on the sea, right next to the Pyrenees. And it was during World War II, it was often the first place in Spain that people who were fleeing across the border from France reached. It was the first real town that people got to. And it became somewhat infamous because the philosopher Walter Benjamin committed suicide there. He had fled across the border from France to Spain, and then was told that Franco was going to send him back. And he considered that to have been certain death and thought that it would be better to commit suicide rather than to fall into the hands of the Germans. And this ended up ironically saving the lives of many other Jews and many other German intellectuals, French intellectuals, etc., because it created such bad press for Franco that after that Franco started to let people go through. He didn't send anyone back. And that meant that actually a few months later, Hannah Arendt was able to come through Portbou as well, and she was not sent back. And she wrote a lovely essay about it, about visiting the cemetery in Portbou that is built. It's built looking out over the sea, and I visited there, the cemetery when I went there. And right next to the cemetery, there is a famous memorial to Walter Benjamin that I think was made by an Israeli sculptor. That's sort of a narrow tunnel that looks out over the sea. And so this was the first poem that I wrote thanks to my Fulbright Award, and it is called Portbou. To leisurely travel here to Portbou, where others have fled through. To exist as a tourist in a world full of others running for refuge. And to stroll down the narrow streets of nearby towns, drinking chocolate, and notice the hollows where mezuzot were torn away from stone. A few decades ago, in another century, the refugee would have been me. In another few years, perhaps it will be. Here I am admiring the sea. To be a tourist can be a beautiful thing, strange in a world of tourists and refugees. And to end, I'm going to read a poem that I think is one of my mom's favorite poems of mine. I have a series of poems that I've written about Jewish holidays. And I was torn with whether to read a poem that I've written about Purim for this or a poem about Passover. But I figured that because that it's better to look forward, and Passover is sort of the next big holiday that's coming up. So I'm going to read the poem about Passover. Passover. With a finger, we remove a drop of wine. for each of the 10 plagues that it took to free us from our bondage in Egypt. One for the water that turned to blood, and one for the frogs that overran the land. One for the lice that infested animal and man, and one for the beasts that came in wild stampedes. One for the epidemic that killed the livestock, and one for the boils that deformed the Egyptians. One for the hail that shot down from the sky, and one for the locusts that came in a swarm. One for the darkness that covered the sun, and one for the slaying of each firstborn son in the land of Egypt without the blood of a lamb, painted as a sign over his door. But the most important drop of wine, my favorite, is the 11th one that I lick off my finger after all the others are done. Thank you. And that was all the poems that I planned to read.
We're going to take some questions, but I just wanted to say, joining us in the chat, we have someone from Rochester, New York, Rhode Island, and Brookline, which is Auntie Loie. And thank you for your beautiful reading.
That was amazing. Just amazing. Do we have questions?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, your poems and poetry. My grandmother used to sing a song that if it sounds, I mean, if you have no music, it reads like a poem. So I was wondering if you knew this Yiddish song. It goes, En unser Gotten Blumen es voran, avel alles Sorten ois kleiben dan, a rezele, a glekele. Hey, have you heard that?
Yes, I have heard this song.
Okay. Because I don't know anybody else who ever knew it.
Yes, I'm not sure about this song, but a lot of Yiddish songs do read like poetry because in many cases they originally were poems and then the musicians set them to music.
Right.
Yeah, and actually a few of my actually a few months ago somebody wrote to me to say that she had set one of my translations to music and I was very happy about it.
Very much.
Thank you, Nick. Rabbi?
Hi, Maya. It's Rabbi Blumberg. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful translations and poetry with us today. I'm curious if you might share with us a little bit about what your process is like for both translating and writing your own poetry, what you think about in terms of how you make your translations, what kinds of choices you make, and anything you can share about your own writing process.
Well, it's funny because I think that's your the writing process is something that I'm continually rediscovering. And it's tricky because sometimes it works that I decide I'm going to write a poem today and I sit down and I do it. And then other times I try that and it doesn't work at all. And other times, you just sort of have to be always reading poetry and sort of sometimes you do have to wait for the inspiration to hit you. And sometimes it's funny, like sometimes I'll have a certain experience, but it won't be until years later that that I end up writing a poem about it. So the poem about Portbou, I wrote that on the train coming back from Portbou but I hadn't gone there planning to write a poem. I was just curious to see it. And then the poem Hidden Yiddish, it was all about Yiddish, but it was inspired by being in Spain and seeing exploring things related to Jewish life in Spain. So it was ironic that that then inspired me to write a poem about Yiddish. Um, and then with translation, I mean, it's a bit easier with translation to get started because you have the translate you have the original poem to go by, but then it can be harder to finish. It's very, very hard to translate poetry from Yiddish, and you have to sort of always be compromising with the original poem. You can't just go off on your own your own inspiration. You have to work with what's there. So I would say that translation can sometimes it can be more simple to get started, but it's not necessarily easier in the end to finish, I guess. But with translations, what I'm always trying to do is create a real poem in English, not just something that I don't want it to look like it's a translation. I want it to look like a real poem.
Oh, I had similar question about process is like just in your talk, I learned some of the history, like the Night of the Murdered Poets and the history of Portbou, which I wasn't aware. And I kind of wondered when you, in applying for your scholarships, like what part of the history were you aware of that you knew you wanted to go to certain places, and what things came to unfold it as you were studying and, you know, exploring a region? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so when I got my Fulbright grant, I was very interested in the history of refugees who had come over this border between France and Spain. That was one of the things that I wanted to explore. But I ended up going to Portbou because so as part of the Fulbright grant, I had a host institution, which was a cultural center in Barcelona that I was working with, and I was giving poetry readings there. And they're still hosting me in Spain. They're the reason I'm here legally. Um, and somebody there recommended that I visit Portbou and said that it was very interesting, that the memorial to Walter Benjamin was very interesting. And so I learned a lot about it just in visiting it. So I try to be open to recommendations and new things. And then with translating, there were poets like Avrom Sutzkever who I was interested in from the very beginning, especially since I studied Yiddish in Vilna, which was Sutzkever's hometown. But in recent years, I've reached a point where I'm often asked to translate things. So that poem that I began with by Dovid Hofshteyn, I was asked to translate it a few months ago. So and then the poems in Geheimstadt in Secret City by Sutzkever, I was asked. That's not that's not the collection that I normally translate from when I'm translating Sutzkever, but I did it because I was asked to. So I sort of am put onto new avenues sometimes just because people commission me to do translations. And with Yosef Kerler, I began translating his poetry because his son was a professor of mine. And so I became curious about his poetry through knowing his son. I hope that helps answer the question.
I had two things I wanted to sort of ask you to talk further about in relation to Merle's question. When you applied for the Fulbright the first time, it was a Fulbright specifically, if I remember correctly, for Greece and Spain.
Mm-hmm.
So you were able to fashion a proposal that incorporated these interests. And I wondered if you wanted to say more about that.
Okay. Yeah, so um, my Fulbright was to Greece and to Spain. It was split between both countries. Um, and so I was interested in the parallels between the Holocaust and the expulsion of Jews from Spain. And so many Jews from Spain went to Greece and then, of course, ended up dying in the Holocaust. But then I was also tracing the kind of the history of Jewish poetic tradition. And when I began to think about it, I realized that you could sort of say that Jewish poetic tradition started during the Hellenistic period in the Mediterranean, which was when there started to be this tension between being a secular Jew and an artist and being a religious Jew, which is sort of like, it's sort of the story of Hanukkah in some ways. And it's why recently I've decided that Hanukkah is my favorite holiday because of this. Even though, anyway, that's like a tangent. But then it continued through Spain because Spain had the golden age of Hebrew poetry, and many of those Hebrew poets then inspired the Yiddish poets that I've translated. And so, um, and then I was also interested in just the connection between these countries and Jewish culture into the 20th century and 21st century, and the majority of the Jewish population in Spain today is actually Ashkenazi because they've come from Argentina. Um, and then, there are a lot of connections between Yiddish culture and Greece because both countries were so affected by World War II. So it was a lot of things, a lot of things fused together for the Fulbright.
The other thing I thought might be interesting to say more about is the project that inspired the Hideout book in Frankfurt.
Yeah. Um, so this was really interesting, and I was really happy that they asked me to be part of this. Um, so a Polish, I believe non-Jewish, uh, sort of architect slash sculptor came up with this project in which she investigated hiding places that were used by Jews during the Holocaust in Poland and Ukraine. And it was originally at a museum in Poland. And then, so she created sculptures that were inspired by these hiding places. And so in one case, the hiding place was actually inside of a tree. They hollowed, I think the tree was already somewhat hollow inside, but two brothers hid in it and they widened the hollow in the tree and they even built steps going down the tree. And she explored these hiding places and she made sculptures inspired by them. And then it was first in a museum in Poland, and then was uh, then the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, Germany, decided to hold the exhibition as well, and they published this book to accompany it. And they thought that these poems by Sutzkever would be a nice inclusion because it was all about hiding in the sewers in Vilna during the Holocaust. And then there are some other essays as well as an interview with a very well-respected Polish Jewish filmmaker in the book as well. So I was really honored to be asked to be part of it.
Hi, Maya, it's Gail. And
Hi.
so I have three quick questions for you. One, what are you working on now? What's on your wish list? And for you, is there a connection between tango and poetry?
Oh yeah, actually, I was just applying for a fellowship at the New York Public Library. about the connection between Jewish culture and tango. Because actually, well, I mean, the lyrics of tango songs are poetry, but also there's a big connection between Jewish culture and tango. If other people don't know, in my other life, I dance tango. And it's something I do a lot in Barcelona. Um, but there's a very strong connection between Jewish culture and tango, and especially between Yiddish and tango. And there's a whole genre of klezmer music that consists of Yiddish tango. And I know at the beginning, Merle mentioned that during the Holocaust, musicians were, they were forced to perform in concentration camps. And oftentimes what they were performing was tango. So I could like go on and on about this. But yeah, that's actually one of my current projects is writing a book of poetry about tango. Um, and then let's see, I'm I'm still trying to get my first book of poems published, which hasn't been so, it's pretty difficult. Um, and I have, at this point, I have two Sutzkever collections that I'm trying to publish. So I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to translate a specific Sutzkever volume called Poems from My Diary. But then because I've been commissioned to do other Sutzkever translations, I have a good amount of material that could be used for a selected edition of Sutzkever. So I'm trying to get both of those books published. Yes. And I don't know if I missed the question. I feel like there
Your
were
wish
three.
list, but that might be your wish list.
Yes, yes. Yeah, my wish list is getting all those published and getting funding so that I can keep writing poetry.
A comment and a question. I guess my question is that it seems like such a niche. And when we read books and people give their acknowledgments and who read the books and editors, and so are there people you turn to when you're doing a translation to say, like, what do you think of that? Did it capture? It's, what I'm saying, like, who else can you confer with? Or maybe it's that you don't need to, and that's freeing to be able to do that.
Well, some translators of poetry prefer to translate only poets who are dead because they can't argue about translation choices. But sometimes if there's some, because Yiddish is a very, very hard language to translate from. And so sometimes if I have a question, I will turn to, past teachers that I've had. And translating the book of Yosef Kerler translations was an interesting experience because um, I had Kerler's son, Dovid Kerler, as a Yiddish professor, and he was very happy about the book. And he gave me a lot of really helpful insight about the poems. And if anyone's interested, he wrote the introduction to the book. And he's also, if I have a question about a Sutzkever, something in Sutzkever, I can also ask him. And then I have a friend who runs an organization called the Congress for Jewish Culture, who's always, who's usually willing to sort of give me his perspective on something that I have translated.
Thank you. And then my comment was because of the timeliness, like which poem I happen to notice, not to do number 132 in this book is a poem about almond blossoms. And I think the Parshas, the recent last week and this week talk about details for the tabernacle and whether it's the priestly vestments or the cover for the Torah, whatever, but there are almond blossoms featured.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that would be beautiful for people to look at that poem.
I'm so happy to say to you, Maia, that your mother has reminded me that you are available for speaking engagements and that you have, I love it, and that you have two books. or one book, something wonderful is all of us are going home with. Um, these books are for sale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good thinking.
So if someone wants to go home with a copy of Hideouts, it's $35, and then it's available through Amazon. And if someone wanted to get as a gift one of the bird's cage to a thin branch for someone else, that's $25, and it's also available through the Yiddish Book Center.
I have another person who would like to speak with you.
Hi, Maya.
Hi.
So I had a anatomical question.
Okay.
Okay, so when you were translating from Yiddish to English, there was reference about something as blue as a spleen to skin.
Yeah.
Was that an exact translation from the Yiddish for spleen?
Yes, and apparently this was this is a good question, Dad, because it was something that I was very puzzled by when I was translating it. And I ran it by a few people to make sure that I had it right. And it was sort of apparently in Yiddish culture, this was sort of a common sort of expression, like blue as a spleen. Like
Ah, because
yeah, there was
although this is not you understand, I never practically try to get close to the spleen unless they pull me in to assist in some laparoscopy. But the spleen is sort of bluish.
Mhm.
Which there was some unfortunate episode where someone made a mistake and they thought they were on the wrong side of the body when they were trying to do a splenectomy and ended up messing up the person's liver.
Oh, yeah, that's more important than a spleen.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, you can live without a spleen, but you can't really live without a liver, anyway. So,
Mm. Yes, I thought that that was very odd when I saw it, but I ran it by some people and they said that that
yeah,
was what it
it does have
was.
more of a bluish tinge, I think, than the liver, anyway.
Mm.
So, and in reference to Ukraine, did I hear that the some reference that they refer to Ukraine as Goy or
In Yiddish, goy specifically means Ukrainian.
oh,
But it's sort of it's like,
but
that was how it
Goy
began.
in
A Ukrainian peasant,
Goy
basically.
in Hebrew is just means nation.
Yes, but Yiddish is different from Hebrew. Yeah, but it began that it specifically as a reference to Ukrainians, but then expanded to include any non-Jew. But it's n-
But
generally
exact
Ukrainian
translation from
peasants.
Hebrew would just be nation. But anyway,
Yeah.
all right. Nice to see you, Maya.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you so much, Sheila, and Maya and whoever is responsible. I think it's the mother, um, for and the father for being so generous with bringing us books for our personal libraries, and it's really quite beautiful. It's really stunning. And we appreciate it very much, and we appreciate you. Please let us know when you're going to be in the United States so that we can bring you back for a tango. That'll get them. We'll have
Yeah.
tango, Yiddish tango, good idea. And then we'll fill up the whole hall, and you can do the most wonderful things that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Anybody else? Thank you so much, Maya. Anything else? Let me say on behalf of LIZKOR and the Sisterhood, it's been a great pleasure having you here. I learned a lot. It's fascinating, and you're a very charming, very, very well-educated young woman
Oh, thank you.
with
Thank
a
you.
great future ahead of her. Thank you, Maya.